Imagine waking one morning to discover that your very existence has become a crime against the state treasury, that the air you breathe, the light that falls upon your dwelling, the width of your smile, and even the beating of your heart have all been transformed into taxable commodities by legislators whose creativity in extracting wealth knows no bounds beyond the limits of human endurance and the breaking point of social order. This was not the realm of satirical fantasy or dystopian fiction, but the daily reality of countless families across history who found themselves crushed beneath the weight of taxation systems so bizarre, so invasive, and so deliberately destructive that they seemed designed not to raise revenue, but to demonstrate the absolute power of authority to transform any aspect of human existence into a source of government income and social control. From the marble halls of imperial Rome to the thatched cottages of medieval England, from the bustling marketplaces of Renaissance Italy to the colonial settlements of the New World, tax collectors armed with ledgers and backed by law transformed the most basic functions of human life into financial obligations. So oppressive and arbitrary that entire bloodlines could be destroyed by a single assessment, a changed regulation, or the vindictive creativity of officials who understood that taxation was not merely about collecting money, but about demonstrating that no aspect of human existence lay beyond the reach of governmental appropriation and control. These were not the familiar taxes on property income or commerce that modern minds expect from organized government, but systematic campaigns of fiscal terrorism that penetrated every corner of private life with assessments so intrusive and punitive that survival itself became a taxable privilege, requiring constant payment to authorities who claimed the right to monetize human existence in all its forms and manifestations. The window tax, implemented across various European kingdoms, represents one of history's most psychologically destructive forms of fiscal oppression, transforming the basic human need for light and air into a luxury commodity that could be denied to families who could not afford to pay for the privilege of seeing daylight in their own homes. Introduced ostensibly as a more equitable alternative to hearth taxes, the window tax required homeowners to pay annual fees based on the number of windows in their dwellings, creating immediate incentives for families to brick up openings that brought light, ventilation, and psychological relief to their living spaces. The tax was deliberately structured to escalate with additional windows, making large, well-lit homes prohibitively expensive, while forcing middle-class families to choose between financial survival and basic environmental comfort. Families across England, France, and other nations implementing window taxes found themselves literally living in darkness, their homes transformed into caves by their own hands as they desperately sought to reduce their tax burden by eliminating sources of natural light that had made their dwellings habitable. The psychological impact was devastating as children grew up in perpetual gloom. Adults developed depression and health problems related to lack of sunlight, and entire communities became landscapes of boarded windows that testified to the government's power to tax away the most basic elements of human comfort. Property values plummeted in areas where window taxes were heavily enforced, as homes became unsellable due to their deliberately impoverished lighting conditions, trapping families in structures they had modified to avoid taxes but could no longer afford to maintain or escape. The tax created perverse architectural innovations as builders designed homes with fewer windows, unusual window shapes that might escape assessment, or elaborate systems of interior mirrors designed to distribute minimal light throughout darkened structures, transforming residential construction into an elaborate game of evasion that diminished quality of life while generating minimal revenue for governments that had prioritized punishment over practical income generation. The hearth tax penetrated the most intimate spaces of domestic life by requiring families to pay annual fees for every fireplace, stove, or heating source in their homes, transforming warmth itself into a taxable luxury that could be denied to families who could not afford to pay for the privilege of avoiding death by cold. Tax assessors were granted legal authority to enter private homes without warning to count heating sources, creating systems of domestic surveillance that destroyed privacy, while generating lists of family assets that could be used for additional taxation or confiscation during times of political tension or military necessity. Families responded by dismantling fireplaces, blocking chimneys, and crowding into single heated rooms during winter months, creating dangerous conditions where carbon monoxide poisoning, hypothermia, and house fires became common consequences of tax evasion efforts that prioritized immediate financial survival over long-term health and safety. The tax created impossible choices for families with elderly relatives, infants, or members suffering from illness who required consistent warmth for survival, but could not afford the escalating fees that made multiple heat sources financially ruinous for households already struggling with other forms of taxation. Rural families faced particular hardship, as their homes typically required multiple heating sources due to size and construction, while their agricultural income was subject to seasonal variation that made regular tax payments difficult to maintain during periods of poor harvest or economic disruption. The hearth tax generated massive resistance, including tax riots, armed confrontations with assessors, and systematic campaigns of non-compliance that required military intervention to enforce, demonstrating the social instability created by taxation systems that attacked basic survival needs rather than luxury consumption or discretionary income. The administrative costs of enforcing hearth taxes often exceeded the revenue generated, as governments were forced to maintain armies of assessors, inspectors, and enforcement officers while dealing with constant legal challenges, violent resistance, and elaborate evasion schemes that made the tax more expensive to collect than to abandon. The salt tax represents perhaps history's most essential example of government monopolization of basic survival necessities, transforming a mineral required for food preservation, cooking, and human health into a controlled commodity whose price could be manipulated to extract maximum revenue from populations who could not survive without regular salt consumption. Governments established salt monopolies that prohibited private production, importation, or sale of salt, while setting prices at levels that consumed significant portions of family income, creating situations where the cost of preserving food often exceeded the cost of the food itself. Families were forced to choose between purchasing legally required salt at government-controlled prices or risking criminal prosecution for salt smuggling, tax evasion, or participation in black market salt trade that could result in imprisonment, property confiscation, or corporal punishment for violations of salt tax regulations. The salt tax created elaborate smuggling networks that operated across national boundaries, generating ongoing warfare between tax collectors and salt smugglers, who used increasingly sophisticated methods to avoid detection while providing illegal salt to communities that could not afford government-controlled prices. Rural communities suffered particularly under salt taxes, as their need for salt to preserve meat, dairy products, and vegetables was greater than urban populations who had access to fresh food markets, while their cash income was often insufficient to purchase salt at monopoly prices designed for urban consumer markets. The tax generated massive social unrest, including salt riots, attacks on government salt warehouses, and systematic campaigns of civil disobedience that required military intervention to suppress, demonstrating the political instability created by taxation systems that attacked basic biological necessities rather than discretionary consumption. Some governments implemented rationing systems that limited the quantity of salt families could purchase, creating artificial scarcity that forced people to choose between adequate food preservation and legal compliance, while generating black markets that provided salt at prices that were illegal, but economically necessary for family survival. The marriage tax transformed the basic human institution of family formation into a source of government revenue, while creating powerful incentives for couples to avoid legal marriage, cohabit without official recognition, or delay family formation until they could afford the escalating fees required for legal recognition of their relationships. The tax was typically structured to escalate based on the economic status, social position, or property holdings of the marrying parties, creating systems where wealthy families paid substantial fees for marriage licenses, while poor families were often priced out of legal marriage entirely, generating two-tiered systems of family recognition that reinforced existing social hierarchies. Marriage taxes created impossible situations for young couples who needed legal recognition to inherit property, establish businesses, or gain social acceptance, but could not afford the fees required for marriage licenses, forcing them to choose between legal compliance and economic survival in ways that destabilized family formation and community cohesion. The tax generated elaborate evasion schemes, including fake marriages designed to avoid higher tax brackets, temporary separations to qualify for lower rates, and complex family arrangements that attempted to preserve inheritance rights while minimizing tax liability through strategies that often backfired and created additional legal problems. Governments used marriage tax records for additional taxation and surveillance purposes, creating databases of family relationships that could be used to track property transfers, inheritance patterns, and social networks for purposes that extended far beyond revenue generation into systematic monitoring of population behavior and political loyalty. The tax created powerful incentives for emigration, as young couples facing prohibitive marriage fees often chose to leave their home communities rather than pay taxes that consumed their entire savings, contributing to population loss and economic decline in regions where marriage taxes were aggressively enforced. Some communities developed collective resistance strategies, including group marriages designed to qualify for bulk discounts, community funds to subsidize marriage taxes for young couples, and systematic non-compliance campaigns that forced governments to choose between military enforcement and tax abandonment. The beard tax implemented by various rulers, including Peter the Great of Russia, demonstrates the government's capacity to transform personal grooming choices into sources of revenue while using taxation as a tool of social engineering designed to enforce cultural conformity and political submission through the regulation of individual appearance and personal expression. The tax required men who chose to maintain beards to pay annual fees and carry special tokens or certificates, proving their tax compliance, creating systems where personal appearance became subject to government licensing and ongoing financial obligation that could be revoked at any time for political or economic reasons. Enforcement of beard taxes required elaborate inspection systems where tax collectors examined men's faces in public spaces, workplaces, and private gatherings to identify tax evaders who might be growing beards without proper licenses, creating climates of surveillance and harassment that transformed personal grooming into a form of political resistance or submission. The tax created impossible situations for men whose religious beliefs required beard maintenance, but who could not afford the escalating fees demanded by governments that used beard taxation as a tool for suppressing religious minorities and enforcing cultural assimilation through economic pressure rather than direct religious persecution. Rural communities often could not afford beard tax compliance, creating situations where traditional grooming practices became criminalized behaviors subject to fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment that destroyed community cohesion while generating minimal revenue for governments that prioritize social control over practical income generation. The beard tax generated elaborate evasion strategies, including fake beards designed to avoid detection, temporary shaving during inspection periods followed by regrowth, and systematic bribery of tax collectors who were often more interested in personal profit than government revenue collection. Some communities developed collective resistance, including group shaving ceremonies designed to demonstrate compliance while maintaining cultural identity, community funds to subsidize beard tax payments for religious minorities, and systematic non-cooperation with inspection efforts that required military intervention to enforce. The dancing tax levied on public celebrations, festivals, and social gatherings demonstrates how governments could transform community joy and cultural expression into sources of revenue while using taxation as a tool for monitoring and controlling social activities that might provide opportunities for political organization or cultural resistance. The tax required organizers of dances, festivals, and celebrations to pay fees based on the number of participants, duration of events, and types of music or entertainment, provided creating financial barriers to community gatherings that served essential social functions for maintaining cultural identity and community cohesion. Enforcement required tax collectors to attend social events as uninvited monitors, who counted participants, evaluated entertainment, and assessed fees that often exceeded the cost of organizing celebrations, making spontaneous community gatherings financially impossible, while forcing social activities underground, where they could not be easily monitored or controlled. The tax created powerful incentives for communities to abandon traditional celebrations, festivals, and cultural practices that had maintained social bonds across generations, contributing to cultural destruction that served political purposes of weakening community identity and resistance capacity while generating minimal government revenue. Rural communities suffered particularly under dancing taxes, as their seasonal festivals and harvest celebrations were essential for maintaining social cohesion during periods of economic hardship, while their limited cash income made tax compliance financially devastating for entire communities that depended on collective celebration for psychological and social survival. The tax generated elaborate evasion strategies, including private celebrations disguised as religious services, dancing events relocated to avoid tax collector jurisdiction, and systematic bribery of officials who were often willing to overlook violations in exchange for personal payments that exceeded potential tax revenue. Some governments use dancing tax records for political surveillance purposes, creating databases of community gatherings and social networks that could be used to identify potential centers of resistance or political organization, transforming cultural celebration into opportunities for government intelligence gathering and political control. The chimney tax represented an escalation of hearth taxation that required families to pay fees based on the number of chimneys in their homes, creating incentives to eliminate smoke evacuation systems that were essential for safely operating heating and cooking fires while avoiding carbon monoxide poisoning and house fires. Families responded by sharing chimneys between multiple fireplaces, blocking unused chimneys to avoid taxation, and crowding cooking and heating activities into single chimney systems that created dangerous conditions where inadequate ventilation led to frequent accidents, health problems, and property destruction. The tax created elaborate architectural modifications as homeowners attempted to disguise chimney numbers through false roofing, hidden vents, and complex internal ductwork designed to serve multiple fires through single external chimneys that often failed to provide adequate ventilation for the heating systems they were supposed to serve. Rural families faced impossible choices between tax compliance and fire safety, as their homes typically required multiple chimneys for cooking, heating, and food processing activities that could not be safely consolidated into single ventilation systems without creating serious risks of carbon monoxide poisoning, house fires, and inadequate temperature control. The tax generated massive resistance, including systematic non-compliance attacks on tax assessors and community-wide campaigns of chimney concealment that required aerial surveillance and military intervention to detect and punish, demonstrating the social instability created by taxation systems that attacked basic safety infrastructure rather than luxury consumption. Property values declined in areas where chimney taxes were aggressively enforced as homes became less desirable due to their compromised heating and ventilation systems, while insurance costs increased due to higher fire risks associated with inadequate chimney systems that families had modified to avoid taxation. The legacy of bizarre taxation extends beyond historical curiosity to illuminate fundamental patterns of governmental overreach and the human capacity for fiscal oppression that continue to shape contemporary tax policy and political resistance in ways that reveal the enduring tension between state revenue needs and individual survival rights. The historical experience with bizarre taxes demonstrates that governments will tax any aspect of human existence if they believe they can enforce collection and suppress resistance, revealing the importance of constitutional limitations on taxation power and democratic oversight of fiscal policy to prevent the revival of historical patterns under contemporary conditions. Understanding the social destruction caused by bizarre taxation provides crucial insight into the relationship between fiscal policy and social stability, demonstrating that taxation systems must respect basic human needs and cultural practices to maintain political legitimacy and social cohesion, rather than pursuing maximum revenue extraction through the systematic attack on survival necessities. The psychological impact of living under bizarre taxation systems created populations characterized by fear, evasion, and systematic mistrust of governmental authority that persisted long after specific taxes were abandoned, revealing the long-term political costs of fiscal policies that prioritize short-term revenue generation over sustainable governance and social stability. Contemporary tax systems continue to exhibit features reminiscent of historical bizarre taxation, including complex regulations that make compliance difficult, escalating penalties that can destroy families through single violations, and administrative systems that prioritize enforcement over fairness or proportionality in ways that echo the fiscal oppression that characterized earlier periods of governmental overreach. As you contemplate these historical examples of taxation systems that transformed basic human needs into government revenue sources while destroying family stability and community cohesion, consider how contemporary fiscal policies continue to exhibit similar patterns of overreach, invasion of privacy, and disproportionate punishment that serve governmental convenience rather than genuine public needs or social welfare. The medieval and early modern experience with bizarre taxation reveals that fiscal oppression requires constant vigilance and democratic resistance to prevent governments from using taxation as a tool of social control and political manipulation rather than legitimate revenue generation for essential public services and social infrastructure. If this exploration of history's most destructive taxation systems has revealed patterns of fiscal oppression that extend beyond historical contexts into contemporary tax policy and governmental overreach, share your insights, subscribe for more investigations into the mechanisms of institutional power. And remember that understanding historical precedents provides essential knowledge for recognizing and resisting fiscal policies that serve governmental control rather than genuine public welfare and social stability. Would you have recognized the systematic nature of bizarre taxation while living under its comprehensive regulation of daily life? Or would you have accepted fiscal policies that transformed basic survival activities into government revenue sources while destroying family stability and community cohesion through the systematic monetization of human existence?